Just stop. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Morning to everybody here on a drizzly morning in Glasgow, as well as to everybody who's online, both in South Africa and around the world. I am Joanne Yawich from the NBI, and I'd like to welcome you to the Finance Day at the South African Pavilion in Glasgow. We've got a great lineup of events today, which will be explained to you in a few minutes. But we'll start the morning straight after this and after the introductory session and the framing of the session that Steve Nichols from the NBI will do with an outline of the rest of the day, and then go on to Presidential Climate Commission panel discussion and presentation on the Eskom's Just Energy transaction and on the financing issues in South Africa related to the need to finance the South African just transition. So we are hoping that we will be able to have a set of in-depth engagements. For those of you online, we will be monitoring the chat, and I hope that you will be able to participate as actively and as fully as the audience that is present here at the South African Pavilion at the COP26 in Glasgow. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So I wanted to give a quick introduction to the investments environment in South Africa and the challenge that we face, predominantly drawing on some work that NBI and BUSA and BCG have been doing over the last 18 months, looking at zero carbon investment pathways for a range of sectors in South Africa. But maybe the opening statement is really about South Africa's specific context. South Africa is in a really unique situation that we have these characteristics of both developed and developing economies. We have an economy that is characterized by high emissions per GDP and high emissions per capita, amongst the highest in the world, it's often cited in the top 20. But we also have amongst the highest social indicators in the world, highest inequality, extreme levels of poverty, and extreme levels of unemployment. And so you have this kind of dual economy of both the private sector being relatively wealthy and well capacitated, but the majority of South Africa's population living in unacceptable conditions. And this has some implications for international aid. So South Africa is not going to be first in line for international aid always, because we have this well-capacitated private sector, we have some local savings. And so what we have to be thinking about in this investment discussion is how do we leverage the international support that we will get, probably not as much as we would like, and maybe not even as much as we might need, but how do we leverage it into the right opportunities so that we're focused on driving investment and competitiveness in the economy. And that's particularly acute when you look at South Africa's balance of payments. And so these are the commodities that we export into international markets, and we earn foreign currency from these commodities, and we use these commodities, this foreign currency, for two key issues. One is managing debt, and debt in South Africa is a big deal. Post-COVID, debt to GDP ratio in South Africa is over 80%, somewhere around 84%. And we also use these foreign currency earnings to import products like liquid fuels, which at least in the medium term, we use to run our economy. And throughout the transition, this balance between the currency that we earn on exports and what we use them for, and our ability to maintain debt and therefore hopefully upgraded to acceptable credit ratings, is fundamental to the transition. And if you look at these commodities, platinum group metal, coal, iron ore, gold, ferroalloys, motor vehicles, particularly the internal combustion engine, probably not a portfolio you would choose if you were looking for a carbon-friendly portfolio. Third of platinum group metal demand is used in the autocatalytic converter, which is part of the internal combustion engine. So items 1 and 6 very vulnerable to the changes of the in internal combustion engine and battery vehicle markets. And we expect the last internal combustion engine to be made somewhere between 2028 and 2035. So these are very near-term risks. When we think of climate risks and we worry about 2050, the policy-induced transition risks are happening in South Africa today. And this is something that we have to be very careful about. Coal will be out of the economy by 2050. Iron ore, gold, and ferroalloys, their competitiveness will be dependent on two factors: whether they can get net zero technologies themselves and also have cheap energy input costs. And so just to really make the point that the transition, global transition to climate change and the shift in commodity demands is a very real economic pressure for South Africa. And just to remind us of the social context. So in this transition, in managing the technology, in managing the emissions, our primary goal as South Africans is to manage inequality, unemployment, and poverty. And so these are the things that we have to build into any investment deal that we might do. And so how we think about this is we have a labor force of today that has a certain amount of permanent, highly skilled, high-income people and a high level of unemployment. And we need to deploy a range of levers to get us to a labor force of the future that will ideally have more permanent, more highly skilled, more high-income people and far lower unemployment. And there's a range of key enablers that we must deploy to move us from today to the future that include policy, that include things like early retirement, that include measures around social welfare. But the underlying driver of all of this is investment. Most of the economic modeling that's been done in South Africa shows that in order to have an economy that's competitive in 2050, we need significant GDP growth. IDRI released a study this week that looks at, that uses modeling from South Africa's University of Cape Town, that drives GDP up by 200% by 2050. And the root cause of that, investment. And so that really is what today is about. So the key enabler that we have to pull is investment in our economy, and both place-based, where you're going to have particular social impacts, but also in the economy as a whole. And that investment can't just be thinking about emissions and jobs and skilling as we typically think about in the just transition. It also has to think about a broader range of issues in the South African context. We have to think about social welfare. We have to think about managing geographic and cultural dislocation. We have to think about economic inclusion and participation. If you think that South Africa's youth unemployment rate is now over 50%, and on an expanded definition of youth unemployment is over 75%, the inclusion of the youth in this transition is critical. Also, we know from studies and experience that including women in these transitions is not only important to redress inequality, but also in the success of projects. We know that climate change projects that involve women are more successful and also have a bigger knock-on impact into communities. Ownership is a critical issue, particularly as a key driver of inequality. So how do we make these investments and transfer ownership? And I've used this example before at COP so far, but you often cite examples of wind farms, community-owned wind farms in Surrey in the UK. And it turns out most of the community that own these wind farms are retired investment bankers. They have capital, they have experience, whereas the communities that will require ownership in South Africa have very low levels of education, very low levels of access to markets and zero capital. And so this is a particularly challenging part of the financial process. And then there are also things around quality of work, and in South Africa, a close connection between the private sector, municipalities, and delivery of service to communities. So, for example, in some of the mining districts, the mines run wastewater treatment plants and waste delivery collection plants and water treatment plants on behalf of the communities. And so as those mines are phased out of the economy, then you have this consequent knock-on impact on communities. And so the finance deals that are thinking about a just transition have to not only be thinking about the technology and the financial engineering around the technology, but all of these other social issues as well, in order to drive the right types of investment into our economy. And then, of course, there are the obvious opportunities. So these are things that have come out of the studies that we've been doing for the last 18 months, the things that most people are looking at. It's interesting to note that there are more jobs to be created from the transition to renewable energy than will be lost in coal. There's investment that may be needed in peaking gas to help roll out renewables and protect against intermittency. South Africa has an excellent expertise in the Fischer-Tropsch method, and so we can produce green fuels using hydrogen and really sort of beneficiate. There is a huge opportunity for diversifying our mining investments away from coal into things like copper and lithium that are needed in the new green economy. There's huge infrastructure that's going to be required, particularly in upgrading our energy grids to be able to cope with renewable energy that needs increased demand for steel and for cement. Switching to electric vehicle manufacturing, I mentioned that our sixth biggest export is the internal combustion engine. There's no reason why our second biggest export can't be the battery electric vehicle, and that's the opportunity for us to shift, as well as localizing some of the components of that manufacture, as well as localizing renewable energy manufacture. Green hydrogen, huge opportunity in South Africa, something we had a big event on yesterday, that also looks at the opportunity to export hydrogen into global markets, particularly the EU, as they seek to implement their green transition plans. Fuel cell uses provide an additional use for platinum. So about 50% of employment and revenue in the mining sector in South Africa comes from a combination of platinum and coal. And then, of course, there's straight financial services. South Africa has one of the most competitive banking sectors in the world, and consistently rated in the top 10 by the World Economic Forum Global Competitive Index. And so we can provide green finance services not only in South Africa, but also to the continent as a whole. But these are the things that we kind of talk about often. And there are additional opportunities that require investment. And so this is some data from the Harvard Atlas for Economic Complexity, which effectively allow you to reverse engineer what an economy could produce based on what they can produce. So at a very simple level, if you can build cars, you likely can roll steel. If you can roll steel, you can build wind towers. And so then we can get a kind of universe of possible things to make, and then rank them on their sort of what's called distance to market, how much investment is needed in order to transition to a functioning sector, but then also how large that market is globally, taking into account commodity changes driven by climate policy. And there you get a whole range of things that people haven't really thought about. Natural and abrasive powders, for example, particularly using byproducts of the diamonds sector, non-woven textiles, and then things that people have really never heard about. So monofilaments, for example, I've presented this speech a couple of times, and I've asked probably 10 audiences what monofilaments are, and nobody knows. Which suggests that there's a world of opportunity out there that we haven't really got to grips with yet. And so to get back to this point around investment, what we're trying to do is lay a landscape in South Africa to say, actually this is a good destination for investment. We've made the right levels of commitment from business and government around net zero 50 within a fair share carbon budget. We have a really solid commercial private sector. We have a really solid banking sector, and this is somewhere that people can invest, and a significant opportunity for investment that can be triggered. And so I'm not going to talk to this slide in a lot of detail, but these are the investment outputs per sector that have resulted from our net zero carbon pathways journey. And those of you that are here with us at COP, you can find the story on the infographics that are scattered around the pavilion. But key to this is the volumes. So the amount of investment needed in the electricity and power sector is 4 trillion rand. The amount of investment needed in the transport sector is 3 trillion rand. And these are significant numbers, and not necessarily numbers that are achievable purely off the back of South African public and private sector balance sheets. And so there will be a need for us to open up our economy to investment from outside, international investment in particular, but also a very prudent leveraging of international support, so that we use concessional finance and grants where they're needed in order to be able to leverage those opportunities and make our economy competitive. And the easiest example there is our calculations show that the break-even weighted average weighted cost of capital for hydrogen is 5.5%. Now that's below current rates in the market. And so what we would have to do is to be able to leverage international support and finance with domestic support, with policy relief, with sort of guaranteed offtake agreements with the EU, for example, to mitigate the risk on those transactions, to reduce the cost of capital in order for us to be competitive in global markets. And if we're able to do that, that then replaces some of those bars lost, for example, in the coal balance of payments chart that I showed earlier. So this then becomes the challenge and really the topic for today. So we have a really exciting program of speakers talking through some of these challenges and some of the specifics. We will have a session with some of the CEOs of some of South Africa's largest companies, talking about their investment opportunities and what they're exploring. We will have a session a little bit later it's kind of an investment roadshow going through specific examples, and the last but certainly not least is the session at the end of the day looking at green iron as an export opportunity. And so that I think will be a really interesting day, and we hope that you will join us for the entirety of the day. Just to make the point that because it's a long day, for those of you who are online, there will be 3 separate links. The first link is the one that you're on now, that will link to both the introduction and to the first session hosted by the Presidential Climate Commission of South Africa. There then is a second link for the CEO roundtable session, and then finally a third link after the break for the investment roadshow towards the end of the day. So we really hope that you'll join us and that you'll have a wonderful day, and look forward to your interaction. And please do feel free to ask questions in the chat and to engage with us throughout the day. So thanks very much, and I will hand back to Joanne.
Thank you, Steve. We are going to move directly into the start of the Presidential Climate Change Commission session on financing a just transition in South Africa. And where we are in South Africa at the moment is that recent development in our political climate have shown that we have some really positive prospects for fast tracking the decarbonization process. So I think that the South Africa's revised NDC indicates that, as well as the work that has been done both in the public sector around the Eskom just energy transaction, as well as the work that has been done in the private sector around 2050 net zero pathways for different sectors of the South African economy. Now, for South Africa needs a just and inclusive transition internationally, and for the framework to be put in place internationally that will then enable us as a country to play our part and to be able to address both climate impacts as well as ensure that our mitigation objectives are met. And the Presidential Climate Commission has played a crucial role in advising the South African government on its climate change response, despite the fact that it is a relatively new institution, and has also been instrumental in driving mitigation and adaptation pathways to build a climate resilient economy and to lay the basis for securing climate finance. And what we are talking about today is the climate finance part. And this session that the PCC is holding today aims to bring together climate finance experts, development practitioners, a number of commissioners from the PCC and the private sector to share South Africa's experience, as well as facilitate an exchange on the country's common mileage and upcoming hurdles that we're going to have to overcome in relation to just transition financing. And so in this session, what we're going to do is to try and explain and give an opportunity to engage on the PCC's role in relation to climate finance, and in particular to talk about the issue of what just transition finance means. We're going to talk about the possibilities for South Africa as a low carbon investment destination. And we're going to start off in the first part of the session by having a set of presentation on South Africa's just energy transaction as led by Eskom. We've got a great panel of speakers. We have and I'm going to introduce them all to you at this point in time, and then they will then come up and speak. Firstly, we have Rudy Dix from the Office of the Presidency in South Africa, and he's from the Project Management Office in the Presidency that is anchoring the Eskom Just Energy transaction. I thought that Rudy might not be here, but I'm very pleased to see him present in the room. Then we're going to have a lead input from Mandy Rambros, who heads up the Just Transition Office at Eskom, and who's also a Presidential Climate Change Commission commissioner. That session, we'll have a question and answer session after those inputs, and then we'll move on to a panel discussion. And I'm going to introduce the panelists, Deepak, now, if that is okay with you. The panel will be facilitated by Deepak Patel, who heads up the finance work in the PCC Secretariat, and Joanne Bate, who's a commissioner and also the CFO of the Industrial Development Corporation, will be on the panel, as will Madeleine Ronquest, who heads up, she's the group head of environmental, social and climate risk at FirstRand. She will be joined by Ms. Catherine Kaufman, who's the group executive for project preparation at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Then in addition, there's Mr. Joseph Nganga, who's the executive director of the Rockefeller Foundation and Global Alliance Africa. And last but not least, Salim Fakir, who's the executive director of the African Climate Foundation. So a great panel and a great lineup. We hope the session will be both informative and educative, and provide all of you here in the room and online an opportunity to interrogate all of these issues with us, in order that we are developing a deeper consensus in South Africa around the issues related to climate finance. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rudy Dix to take the platform, and he will be followed by Mandy Rambros.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks, Joanne. I suppose what I'll do is speak a little bit about the context setting and where we're at, and leave the proper debate around the financing aspects to the experts. I'm not an expert in the financing areas, although some here may say that I do understand a little bit of it. But In the last month or two, we moved pretty fast, and that allowed us to put into place an ability to look at a number of options around financing for a just transition. So firstly, I think what was pegged about us moving in this direction was the fact that we were able to for the first time, with the help of with an excellent team, some of them on the panel over here, Mandy, for example, led by a collective of ministers, to firstly get a just transition framework in place. And I think that was fundamental, because we've been quibbling about that for a bit of time, and it didn't help the South African government and cabinet to be able to take a uniform position. Of course, the ability to be able to achieve that was quite important. Secondly, and in parallel to that, government was able to take an important position on a new NDC target range. Now that in itself allowed us to be able to cost and get a sense of how much it is going to be roughly what a just transition financing framework would look like, and the specific areas that we needed to move into. And I thought those are important events that led us to a particular point where we were able to, for the first time, I think, in quite a bit of time, to move into a conversation with firstly, of course, with the international partner group, the US, UK, the EU, and France and Germany. And of course, the ability for us to be able to use that as leverage to look at financing for just transition. But the context of why this is quite important, I mean, given that this is a new terrain and field for us, just transition is quite important, and financing for just transition is quite critical. This is my first COP, right? And the one thing that I've come to learn is that there's always complexities around language. And one thing that you say now doesn't mean the same thing in the way that you interpret things. And so, of course, when you talk about financing for a just transition, there are a lot of complexities around this and lots of interpretations. And the one thing that we've kind of learned in putting together the political declaration is that if you're not clear as to what financing for just transition is, it may mean very narrow in a sense. So in our sense, given our historical background and the high level of challenges that we face in South Africa, just transition is quite important. So in some sense, when we entered into, and I'm using this as an example, when we entered into the initial conversation with the IPG group, just transition for them was simply a just energy transition that looks at supporting Eskom in its transition. And of course, the first question was, so what about the entire value chain? You know, what about coal communities? What about workers? What about industries that are dependent on the value chain? And those are fundamental issues that if you don't raise it in a particular context, you tend to lose out on, getting what a true just transition and financing. The second challenging component, which of course, we pick that up, and of course, it's quite a significant conversation in the COP negotiations, and Mandy is quite part of that, is that there's a lot of talk on mitigation, on, we're happy that you've got a revised NDC target. But in actual fact, when you talk about the aspects of adaptation and how you support the changes that are required for you to be able to become more resilient, there's a degree of quietness on the side of developed partners who are required to give the kind of commitments that are there. So I think this is quite important and teaches us a bit of lessons. But I thought perhaps it's important to just talk a little bit more about the context, because I think there's a misunderstanding on the context of the political declaration. So firstly, it's not an agreement. I think it's important to spell that out. There's no signed agreement. It's not an MOU. It's merely a political declaration and a statement that provides a certain number of commitments, and none of these commitments are beyond what we have publicly declared. And I think that's very, very important. Secondly, there's an offer on the other side. So I'm a bit hesitant to say those are commitments. Those are, in the bag, they would say, the 8.5 billion. And so I think it's quite important that that's a fundamental and first step, that it's not an agreement, There's no MOU. And I think there's lots of misinterpretation and understanding of what the 8.5 billion is in terms of the political declaration. And I think it's important to clarify. Now, what does that mean? That, of course, means it's the first step. So fundamentally, if it is an offer of 8.5 billion or a pledge of 8.5 billion, you have to get into the details of that. So the next phase of that conversation is, of course, getting a financial work stream going on, having to understand what the 8.5 billion is about. Now, the 8.5, as we know, of course, is a combination of different financing mechanisms. There are grant components to it. There's high levels of concessional finance to it. There's normal debt instruments that are part of it also. And I think it's quite critical for us to be able to ensure that we unpack that. We unpack that in a great amount of detail. We understand what it means. We understand that the kind of financing arrangement is not going to make us worse off, and that it is quite beneficial to be able to fund. That's the first thing. The second part, and I think it's quite critical for us to do that it's not just only about energy. There are three components to the first phase of that particular declaration that is there. And again, many tend to miss that because it's quite fundamental for us that although electricity contributes the highest 41 to 45% of GHG emissions, and of course, it makes obvious sense for us to be able to move into that area of trying to develop a just transition program. A greater component of the financing, once it's secured, and we've signed off on it, is towards electricity and that kind of shift. That's it. Mandy will speak a lot about it. A lot of it will go into different components of transmission, of course, microgrids, generation, distribution, supporting coal communities. But there are two aspects that I think people tend to miss and fundamentally don't see, and they are in the initial stages of development. The first, of course, is the manufacturing of electric vehicles, and that's quite important. So because European Union is our largest export partner in terms of both volume and value, it's important that in the context of where the EU is going around vehicles, for us, adaptation and ability to shift from internal combustion engines into electric vehicles is an important component, and therefore we're going to need a plan and for us to be able to invest in EV. Another, again, and again at the beginning stages, is the third component, which is green hydrogen, and this is a significant opportunity for us to be able to look at that particular sector, both for internal and for export. And so I think it's quite critical that when we understand this package and the offer that is made, we understand it in that particular context. The devil's in the detail, of course, and that's the next step. So we will be putting together an expert finance team. We'll be relying on many of you to provide the kind of guidance and leadership, the technical team, both within government and externally, to enter into a very tough negotiations in the next 6 months. We've set ourselves 6 months to be able to secure the offer that has been made and to ensure that we're able to move in that particular direction. So quite exciting stuff, groundbreaking. The devil's in the detail, of course, but I think we've laid the basis for financing our just transition in the way that we've defined a just transition program that is for our conditions in South Africa. And so I thought, Joanna, perhaps it would be useful just to give that kind of context and a sense of where we're going to in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rudy, and thank you for that context. I think it really is important because I think without these kinds of explanations and without these kinds of engagements, people read into, as you say, into the text a whole lot of things that may not in fact be intended. And I think it's also incredibly useful to understand the process that needs to unfold, and the work that needs to be done in order to be able to concretize this. So at the center, though, as you explained, of this offer is the Eskom Just Energy Transaction. And I'm going to hand over to Mandy Rambros to now talk us through some of the issues related to that. Mandy, thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm just waiting for this discussion to proceed. No, that's all right. It's very strange, talking to an audience and everyone's like, you're not sure if they can hear you. It's almost like being online, right? So unmute yourselves if you need to say something, please. Thanks, Rudy, for that introduction. And thanks, Joe, for the start of this as well. And Steve for the excellent presentation right up front, which really sets the tone and sets sets where we are in terms of the work that was done in South Africa. So from an Eskom, sorry, I've blocked myself. You can see it's been like a long 2 weeks. So from an Eskom point of view, when we looked at the just energy transition and why were we going in this direction and why did we start this plan? There were a number of factors that came together that were a confluence of a number of challenges that we've been facing and that we still face back home. Aging coal fleet, operational performance problems. We are running a coal fleet that's 41 years old on average. Performance is not great. Years and years of a lack of maintenance. If you're running if it's like your car, if you don't maintain your car, and you continue to run it every day, you will have problems. It's the same thing. If you look at a coal-fired power station, if you look at a boiler, if you look at a turbine, we're talking about big pieces of equipment that need maintenance. And if you don't maintain it, you will run into problems. We can go into the reasons why they were not maintained. There's a whole bunch of reasons around there. But we're also very vulnerable to climate change as a country. I already touched on it a little bit earlier, but if we look at South Africa, if you look at the world, the globe, and if you warm, and we're talking about keeping the warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees globally to prevent catastrophic climate change in the world. But if you look at South Africa, we warm at twice that rate. So if you're talking about 1.5 to 2 degrees globally, you're talking about twice that in South Africa due to our geography and due to a number of factors around our vulnerability. So what that means is that it has a tremendous impact on agriculture. So, back home, the CSIR has done some tremendous studies around what is the impact of a changing climate on the country. And one of the things that you would see is that we would lose the ability to produce maize, which is a crop that is extremely important back home. You would lose fynbos. Fynbos only occurs in South Africa. No more rooibos exports, I guess. And then the crop that will continue to grow is potatoes and grow very well. And I'm not sure how many of us want to continue eating potatoes. But beside that, if you look at the other vulnerability, it's water. We would go into extreme drought, more so than we already do. We're already a semi-arid country. And without water, you cannot produce electricity. You can't do much, but you can't produce electricity especially. So I think those kinds of things are extremely important for us to bear in mind when we think about South Africa's vulnerability. If you think about all of these things coming together, a transition for South Africa is inevitable. And that is the value proposition that we've put in these discussions that we've put forward to Cabinet and in the various discussions we've had in the country. And then if you take that a step further, Eskom is around 41% of the country's emissions. And the electricity sector the world over is the quickest and the cheapest to decarbonize. So it's a no-brainer that the first thing you do is decarbonize your electricity sector around the world in order to enable decarbonization across the sectors, across the other 7 sectors. So that is the value proposition we've put forward. And the work that we've done within Eskom is to look at how do we take a transition and make sure that that transition is just. As Rudy very well explained what we mean by just. It's not just about reducing emissions. Decarbonization, obviously reduction of emissions is a key component of transition and of decarbonization, obviously. but it's not something that you can do at the expense of society, at the expense of the impacts that we will have on the local communities. If you look at mining and if you look at electricity production, some of the towns around Mpumalanga and Malahleni in those areas were built around the power station and around the coal mines. So you cannot walk away from those communities. You got to respect the legacy that we have from coal and the legacy that it had in building our economy as a country. But when you know better, you do better. And we know better now. We know the impacts of coal. We know the impacts of what climate change does to us as a society. So the Eskom plan is, if you can think of it, and our chief executive talks about it in concentric circles. If you think of the middle circle, we have the Eskom project. So Rudy alluded to it. The 8.5 billion that we worked blood, sweat, and tears to get on the table now. It's a start. It's not near what we need. It's just the start of what we need. But we've got projects on the table in terms of the generation capacity we want to put on the ground, about 8.5 gigawatts that we're looking at of clean capacity. The reality is we're shutting down 22 gigawatts over the next 15 years by 2035. And you would have to then install 50 to 60 gigawatts of renewables to make up for those 22 gigawatts. So it's not all Eskom. I mean, we need all the plans in the country, the RMIPP programs, the different other programs. We honestly just need to go out there and liberalize the electricity market and invite players to come and invest in renewables in our country. Eskom is a large landowner. We have lots of land in Mpumalanga, and we're saying, let's build the renewables. Let's get it done. We need 50 to 60 gigawatts done. We have an 8.5 gigawatt plan from a generation perspective, which will cost us at around 180 billion rand. So you can see the $8.5 billion is not close enough. From a transmission perspective, in order to connect the renewables IPPs in the Northern Cape and the Eastern Cape, we need about 8,000 kilometers of lines. Again, which will cost us around 120 to 170 billion rand. And then from a distribution perspective, we absolutely want to support bidirectional energy management. So if you put solar panels up on your home, we want you to be able to sell back into the grid. And so the distribution grid upgrade, the municipality grids upgrades will cost us over 50 billion rand. So if you add that all together, coincidentally adds up to about 400 billion rand, which is about Eskom's current debt. So you can see, there's a lot of investment that is required. But this 8.5, I'm not going to scoff at it, it's a start. And it's a start, and we need to really make sure that it gets put into the right projects. Then the second concentric circle around that is the social impact. How do we deal with the social impacts from shutting down our coal plants? We've done various studies at Komati, Groote, and Hendrina, which are the plants we're shutting down imminently. And we've got grant funding to do 7 more of those studies at 7 more of our plants. And what we're doing with those studies is looking at what is the impact that we're seeing from the economic modeling, but what is the impact that people are telling us, from a job creation perspective, from a job loss perspective, and how do we deal with that? There's so much opportunity around local manufacturing, around industrialization, and that is what we're looking to push right now. And then the third concentric circle, I'm conscious of time, so I'm just rushing through the detail. The third concentric circle is the policy framework and the governance. We can talk as much as we like. We can go talk until we're blue in the face around what projects we can implement. But if we don't have the regulatory and the policy support, we will fail. If you look at the 8.5 billion, if you look at the discussions we've been having with various governments, it's a government to government relationship. And obviously excellent support from the presidency, from DFFE and others in the country. But you need that broader policy support for other governments to feel confident in investing in South Africa. So I think that is the third concentric circle that is extremely important. So, in terms of this 8.5 billion as well, we put in a number of safeguards. We are not blind to the fact of the impact of state capture and corruption in our country, and we must be frank and open about that. So it's so important in terms of the funding to put safeguards around that, to have project stage gates, to make sure that the money is going into the projects and is benefiting the communities around us. And not just shareholders and not just lining pockets. We must be very, very frank and clear about where the money is going. So I'm going to end there, but somebody said to me yesterday, well done on the announcement, and it's really great the work that Eskom has put into this. We know the months that you put into it and the years actually that you put into it, and it's so great. And and he quoted Nelson Mandela to me. He says it's not impossible until it's done, and I said absolutely 100%. But Nelson Mandela also said, It's only when you climb a mountain, you find that there are many other mountains to climb. And I know there's a lot of work ahead of us, but all of us working together, we will be able to climb those mountains. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mandy. And I think on the basis of the two inputs that we've had, we are hopefully a lot clearer on what, in fact, this agreement is. I want to, first of all, start by taking two of the questions from the chat. And then we'll allow people in the audience, physically in the audience, to come up. So I'm going to give both, and I think then Rudy and Mandy, you can do a bit of a duet. So the first question is from Tandazo, and it says that it's directed to you, Rudy. You said that the 8.5 million pledge is not an agreement, but a political agreement. What does that mean? So I think you did speak about the devil being in the detail, but I think a bit more of an explanation of process and detail. And then the second question from Nicole Martins is also for you, Rudy, around whether the electric vehicle focus is exclusively on production for export, or are we going to invest in developing South African infrastructure to catalyze the use of electric vehicles? Maybe if I could say, there is a bit of, sorry for the initial interruption, Mandy, but there is a bit of a technical glitch. We're struggling to see the chat. So I apologize to people online if we aren't picking up all of your questions. We're doing our best. This is a very, technically challenging environment at the moment. Thanks. So Rudy, over to you.
Seem to have misplaced my mask, or Joanne, I think you took my mask, so someone has to give me a mask. Okay, so the first part, yeah, I mean, yes, it's a bit tricky, right? Because once you sign and you say 8.5 billion, it has to be very specific as to how and what that money is all about, right? So where is it? Is it flowing from is it public funds, which hopefully we think it should be quite a part of it? Is it using, for example, climate investment fund money and to leverage money within the private sector or elsewhere? And so I think this is the tricky thing that does require for us to be able to get into the details. So what it is, and we've termed it as such. I mean, we've not asked the IPG, are you happy if we say offer? Because it is an offer. It is basically saying, look, we prepared to put $8.5 billion onto the table, but we need to get into the details of how we're going to get to $8.5 billion. And so it does require for us to be able to get into the nuts and bolts of it, right? And therefore, I'm saying if it was an 8.5 billion in terms of a standard kind of country to country, a bilateral agreement, you'd say 8.5 billion. We know we get 8.5 billion. And the 8.5 billion would be a grant from the German government or the US government, and it would flow into our accounts. The complexity of this is that there are many complex financial instruments to get to 8.5 billion. And of course, the devil is in that detail. What we need to ensure is that Joanne stole my face mask. So it's important that we get as close as possible to 8.5 that will not be disadvantageous in terms of either borrowing or having concessional finance, and that's going to be quite critical, colleagues. I'm unable to give in a lot amount of detail. So in a sense, let me put it in this way. We can actually walk away if we feel that the conditions are too onerous. We can actually say, no, we're not happy with this. So we're not happy with the fact that, we've entered into a political declaration with you, but the terms and conditions, we might as well have gone onto an open market and borrow the money, if that's the case, for instance. So So you would have to get, so concession, let's just use concessional finance. What is concessional finance, right? And so, of course, is it close to zero? Is it, when is the repayment terms, et cetera, et cetera? And those kind of details are quite important if we are, as we regularly do, go into the open market to borrow money to, fund our expenditure program. What was the other question again? Oh, yes. So the IDC, and I know quite a number of government entities and departments are, of course, looking at it. It's not only for the export market, I think. I think it's quite important that we do express this, and we have to be frank upfront. I mean, Mandy and her team at Eskom have done quite a lot of work over many years to get to where they are around what needs to be required to look at an energy transition in terms of the Eskom area. Now, none of the other sectors that we are looking at have gone that far. And so it's very in the initial stages, at the beginning stages, but certainly from the initial investment ideas, and Joanne, who is on the call for later on, will speak a little bit more on what the IDC is doing around the EV and the green hydrogen. But certainly it is also about transitioning ourselves, and not only for the export market. So it's about, charging substations. It's about developing supplier, interventions. It's about exports also. And I think this is going to be quite critical for us to be able to look at it as part of expanding. It's going to take a bit of time for us to be able to do many of this kind of stuff. And I think there is still a market for ICE vehicles, of course, but if it is that we're able to develop and expand where we are at in terms of EV and green hydrogen, that's going to be quite critical for us to do that. And that's also for domestic consumption as well. Fred?
Thank you, Rudy. Can I ask if there's anybody here in the room who has a question or a comment that they would like to make? And does anybody want to add anything? Mandy, do you want to add or respond to anything that Rudy has said? Maybe one comment, if I could just make one comment. I think that when we look at the way that climate finance is going to unfold internationally, there is the finance that is part of the obligations that countries have, that the developed world has committed to in the UNFCCC. We talk about this 100 billion, but there's a set of other financial obligations that the developed world has to the developing world within the framework of the convention and the negotiations that we need to look at. And I think that this money that we're talking about, this 8.5 billion, is really part of that. But I think that one of the things that we also need to take into account is that a thoroughgoing decarbonization process of our economy is also going to require mobilization of a very much wider range of sources of funding. It's going to require a reorganization of where government finances are spent. It's going to require the private sector to invest heavily in a very, very diverse and wide range of ways. And so I think that the climate finance conversation is really quite a broad one in that kind of context, and we mustn't forget around what that actually might mean and how it's going to need to contribute. So I see the 8.5 billion as a kind of seed funding almost that hopefully will trigger a much wider set of investments into our economy. Thanks. Do you want to comment, Mandy?
Thanks, Joe. I think I just want to build on that point around climate financing. And, I think for those people that are involved in the actual negotiations around climate financing, Article 9 of the Paris Agreement and Article 6 on carbon markers, which I have the pleasure of co-facilitating at this COP, is that it's very complex. It is not a simple, input-output kind of model that, some of us work with. And so you have to understand a lot of the agenda is also linked to climate financing. So like Rudy says, 8.5 is the start of a financing agreement, memorandum of understanding, but we will not accept financing that is more onerous for us than if we had to go out into the commercial market. So there's an obligation under the Paris Agreement for developed countries to contribute to climate financing in developing countries, but it's not, you know, for at the expense of your own development as a country. So and also to say that, you know, this facility that we conceived of at Eskom is the start. So we were looking at a, you know, pure simple facility that is easy to contribute to, is easy to understand. So like we use the analogy of a building loan, you know, multi-lender facility that you can draw down on, like you do when you're building your house, you know, if you get to foundation height, ceiling height, whatever. So it's a simple, but that does not mean that we cannot stack on other solutions as we go on. So things like the carbon market, things like bonds, green bonds and things. So those will come later on. But if we're talking about putting we have projects ready to go now, like Rudy was saying. If you give us the money, we can build projects now and sort of the regulatory framework, of course. So that's what you need to do right now. So the other thing is around understanding the involvement of the private sector. And I think a lot of people have asked this question around, are we saying that Eskom wants to do all of this? No, we absolutely need the involvement of the private sector. When I said we have land in Mpumalanga, come and build, I meant it. You know, we want the private sector involvement in that, because we cannot eat this elephant, you know, all by ourselves. We have to eat it. And I'm mixing a whole lot of metaphors here, but you know, the point is that we absolutely need everybody to get involved in driving this program forward. Was there a question, Joe?
Thank you. Okay, one last question before I hand over to the panel. It's actually more of a comment, but I think in essence, it really is about the fact of how one brings society in behind these kinds of initiatives. And it essentially says that the majority of people in South Africa don't know that there's a transition taking place. And so how do we involve the people or involve the population broadly in understanding what government intentions are, what Eskom is currently doing, and how, I suppose, in a sense, how do we create ownership of the kinds of processes that we are going into? So I don't know if you want to respond to that, Mandy or Rudy, and then I think we're going to hand over to the panel.
Thanks. So, I mean, that's a great question. So if I use a very practical example, we started off with Komati Power Station, which is in eMalahleni, and it's the first power station that we will shut down. So we have one unit running out of 9, 115 megawatt unit will be shut down in a year from now, October next year. So what we've started doing there is we've started demonstrating repurposing, repowering, that what can be done. So we've built a very small pilot agrivoltaics plant. So for those of you not familiar, agrivoltaics, if you think of a PV plant with very tall gantries and frames, so PV panels on to produce electricity, of course, but tall enough that you can drive a tractor underneath it, which means you can do agricultural activities underneath that. So the idea is to have a dual use of land where you have electricity production. You do lose some efficiency on your plant, but you do have the opportunity then to do agriculture. So what we're doing in that respect is we're working with local farmers in the area to understand what crops can be planted, what agricultural activities can be undertaken. And for us, what the great opportunity there is that it doesn't have to be limited to Komati. We can roll that out to all our power stations. In fact, you can roll that out to a number of areas in eMalahleni. The second thing is the containerized microgrid plant that we've done, that we developed in our R10D facility in Germiston. It is a shipping container, repurposed, simple shipping container. We've been talking to the Danes about giving them to us. And I say giving, I mean giving. So what you do is you put in battery packs, control panels into the container. You have awnings down the side with solar panels. And it's containerized in that you can take that and place it anywhere. And you can have that community connected up to electricity. So the one that we have is 25 kilowatt peak. And it connects, you can do about 10 to 15 homes, obviously, depending on the household usage, which is about between 3 to 5 kVA in South Africa. So if you think about 13% of our population being unelectrified, you can take those containers and drive them anywhere in the country. What we've done is we've moved the assembly and fabrication of those containers to Komati Power Station. We have large, if you've been to a coal-fired power station, you know there are large warehouses. So we have large warehouses that are not being used. We are refurbishing them so that we can do these containerized microgrids. What we do have is a lot of people that want to buy them off us. They cost 1.5 million rand. It's nothing, to electrify 10 to 15 homes. So there's a lot of DFIs, a lot of funders who want to buy them off us. And if we have a production line going, you can employ up to 40 people on that factory to do 2 containers a week. And if you escalate that, you're obviously going to employ more. And because it's low skilled labor, spray painting the containers, but doing the awnings, we're using local manufacture and local communities there. So that is the plan for manufacturing of microgrids as well. Oh,
Yes. Apologies, just one question for Rudy. In terms of the allocation of the 8.5, have you already established in terms of the percentage of grant funding and the concessional that you have to pay back? So that's the first one. Just the allocation. Also the allocation between the energy, EV and the green hydrogen. If you can please answer those two. The last one, the borrower, is it going to be Eskom or is going to be the government? As a result, there's obviously a guarantee issue, depending who is the borrower. Just those 3 questions. Thank you.
There has been some initial conversations as to the components of the 8.5 billion US. It hasn't been finalized yet, so I wouldn't want to express as is yet, so there's some sense of it already. Just before we concluded the political declaration, the SIF had provided 500 million US, so as I understand it, if there's 500 million US through the SIF funds, you're able to leverage potentially additional 2 to 2.5 billion US again, so there's quite a bit of that. Some amounts that are fluctuating. Again, I don't want to put my peg in the ground and say this is the exact amounts. That's all going to be part of the kind of conversation that is there. That's broken up between grant, concessional, normal debt, direct public funding, for example, different financial instruments. The one thing that I want to just say, I think the part for us, it's just the biggest risk is the exchange rate risk, of course. So this is something that I think we need to be quite careful about, right? So, and that is if you're, of course, doing concessional financing US, there is, of course, a significant risk, or EU, or euros. Borrowing in rands, of course, limits the risk, and I think that's the big conversation that we have to have. No decision yet as to which percentage of the allocations, but what I can say, given that how far the Eskom guys are around the facility, a larger percentage of that would have to go towards the Eskom transition. We in the initial stages, as I've said, both with EVs and the green hydrogen, a lot of that will go into getting into commercial, looking at scale. There's quite a bit of work that is being done. So you'd have to look at that in terms of how far you are with each aspects of the transition. It would not be split equally, and so let's be quite clear. The last question was about the. Oh yes, yes. I mean, that's been quite a conversation amongst us, but I think what we have agreed is that the sovereign would set up the single, and we've in a sense taken the lead from Eskom in saying that we're going to set up a just transition financing facility that would allow us, because if we are doing all three, Remember, Eskom is not in the electric vehicle space, neither is it, or at some point later on, it will probably be in the green hydrogen space. So it's important that if we are trying to develop these transition plans and adaptation measures in those sectors, it is the sovereign, it's the country that would have to set up that particular facility. Of course, if we're looking at some of the concessionalities and some of the finance, there is questions around, if there are questions around guarantees, many of these IPG countries, if they are providing us concessional finance, let's just say, some would say that if it's above 2 billion, they expect guarantees. There's this conversation that we still have to have. It's not been finalized yet, but I think we are trying to lower the risk, leverage finance, and to try and ensure that, we don't have to enter into complexing financing arrangements that, as Mandy had said, and I had said, that makes no difference if we borrow from them and we go into the open market. It's important that this has to be, and I use the word because I think it's quite critical that we have to emphasize it. It has to be highly concessional. It has to benefit us. It shouldn't be equal or just below the kind of financing arrangements where we go onto the open bond market and borrow money, because then it doesn't help us at all. It's quite costly, that kind of borrowing arrangements. So I think it's going to be quite important for us to get into the nuts and bolts of that, and ensure that there's a large component of highly concessional financing to be able to fund this particular program. Lots of conversations still have to be had around whether there are guarantees or not on a particular sets of borrowing or limits that are concessional and stuff like that. I hope that helps.
Okay. Thank you, Rudy. We are going to now close this section of this session, and move on to the panel that will be moderated by Deepak. Just to say that we are very privileged to be joined by Mr. Patrick Flamini, who is the CEO of the DBSA, who will also participate in the panel. And if I could ask all of the panelists to now, the ones who are physically present, to come up and to sit at the front. And then those who are online will duly participate. So thank you, everybody, for participating in this session. We didn't get to all the questions, but as I think the sessions in this finance day go forward, I'm certain that most of the questions that we haven't been able to get to are going to have been answered. So thank you very much.
Hi, Joanne. Can you hear me? Joanne Bate.
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. Can I ask you to please put your camera on?
Thank you very much, Joanne.
Thank you. Welcome.
And in the earlier session, I wanted. Can you hear me? It's not on. Hello. Testing. 1, 2. Testing. Am I audible now? Is that okay? No? I think some of the headsets appear not to have volume. Is that okay? Good. Thank you very much, Joanne. The first part of this session by Rudy and Mandy has been extremely helpful in setting the stage to understand that when a political declaration is made with respect to a commitment to assist from one part of the world to the other, the ink needs to be dry before we can celebrate. I think all of us, including the president and the authors of the political declaration, made it quite clear that $8.5 billion is what was going to be utilized for what we would call the leading edge or the first phase of our transition towards a decarbonized economy, but in a way that is just and that carries all of society in South Africa with us. I think Rudy and Mandy have also been very, very helpful in sketching that the devil is in the detail, and that while we're not able at this stage to exactly spell out what the composition and final point of usage of the $8.5 billion is, that commitment has been described as something that we cannot afford the world to have fail. By this, I mean, if it does fail, then it means that transitions all over the world are potentially at risk. That it must be beneficial to the South African transition was also made very clear. That it needs to be affordable, it needs to be of a quality and quantity that is utilizable in our transition, and that finally, it must be sincere and it must provide a catalyst for other forms of funding that come with the rest of our transition. So with that background, it gives me great pleasure to hand the microphone firstly to Patrick Dlamini, who is the CEO of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, who will spend a few minutes talking to us about his perspectives, not only on climate finance, but on development finance, as well as how development finance institutions and development finance itself can play a role in catalyzing, accelerating, and resulting in additiveness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deepak, and good morning, colleagues. Good morning, friends of South Africa, and good morning to our fellow South African back home. I sincerely think that the 8.5 commitment by our international partners is going to be absolutely critical for South Africa to be able to move forward into a low carbon future. As South Africa on our own, it becomes almost impossible given the kinds of challenges and needs that we have to deal with as a developing country. I think this pledge was in recognition of exactly that, to make it easy for us to move forward as a country from a high carbon intensive economy to a low carbon future. We really do need the developed nations to come to the party to make it possible for us to embark on that trajectory of towards the net zero emission future. And I do believe, Deepak, that as South Africa and as the development finance institutions of both South Africa and DFIs in the rest of the world that are operating in South Africa, and the multilateral development banks, we really do have a very, very, very profound role to play in this just transition for South Africa. We have to look at how best and how optimally we can be able to catalyze this 8.5 billion commitment plus other sources of funding that we can be able to put together as DFIs and multilateral development banks to help South Africa to move along. Because I do believe that actually out of just this commitment, remember this is just the beginning, I think we can be able to really catalyze very close to $1 trillion, because with ours also going in as DFIs into this, it really can be a game changer for South Africa. And how then do we make sure that this trajectory really leads into a just, because just in this case, just transition means it's got to be a very much of an equitable transition. It's got to be a very much of an inclusive transition. And it's got to be very fair to the vulnerable. And how then do we make sure that that happens? But as a country, we have a role because we understand our as-is situation as an economy. High inequality, high unemployment, high poverty levels. And therefore, as DFIs, we really do need to work hand in hand with our government to make sure that our role as DFIs is really, really repurposed to make sure that we are able to help South Africa to succeed towards the net zero future. Otherwise, it's going to become impossible. But again, government will have to really come to the party in augmenting us as DFIs to really do our job much more better than ever before. Remember, there's also transformation in this that we also need to drive quite aggressively, and that will have to happen. I don't think it's going to be debatable that as DFIs, we have to do much more than we've ever been able to do before. And that is very possible. Our partners, talking to them even around here, international DFIs, they are extremely, extremely willing to partner with us as South African policy instruments of the states to really play our meaningful role. And I'm quite positive that we will be able to successfully play that role. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to go to the other end of the panel. I'm arbitrarily deciding who should speak. Joseph, being an executive director of the Rockefeller Foundation, but more recently given the responsibilities to deal with the issues as well as the opportunities that arise from the recently announced Global Alliance, is going to tell us, I think, what their plans are as philanthropies to come together to begin to hopefully mobilize the kind of resources that are required not only for South Africa, not only for Africa, but in fact for most of the developing world as they undertake this journey to net zero through a decarbonization process. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for that sanitizing exercise. As a banker, you must be investing in healthcare, and you want to make sure your healthcare and insurance is safe. Thank you, Chair, for the introduction. I just saw my bio on the screen, and it's a few decades old, which I'm delighted because I like to think of myself as my younger self. And yes, it's a tall order to describe what the role of philanthropies is. So I'll speak specifically to what we're thinking about as the Global Energy Alliance. And for those who don't know, the Global Energy Alliance is a partnership among IKEA Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and the Bezos Earth Fund. And together we've come together and put $1.5 billion towards addressing the climate and energy access agenda. We are collaborating with a number of institutions that will leverage an additional 10 billion in the short term and 100 billion in 10 years. And back to the question on what we think our role is. It's a large question, and I'm glad somebody quoted Mandela saying, and I'll paraphrase, that once you've climbed the first mountain, you discover that there are a bunch of other mountains that need to be climbed. The reality is we're exploring this together. It needs to be, the decarbonization discussion needs to happen on an enormous scale across different countries, and it has significant impacts across economies, communities, electrification, and so on. So we are all on a learning curve together. What I would say we are most useful, where we would play the most useful role, is really using philanthropy money, which is not necessarily expecting a target return, that can take a very high risk to help lubricate and accelerate the engagement of others. My colleague here at DBSA probably has a board and an investment committee and credit committees that have very stringent requirements. And there are things that you might not be able to do despite having a substantial amount of resources, because maybe they're too early, maybe the models have not been proven, maybe some studies have not been done, maybe some pilots have not been done, maybe the return expectation is not where you need it to be. I think that's where philanthropy fills the gap. The second piece is agility. The Alliance, we expect that our resources, and I like to say money is in the bank, our resources are available and ready to address this challenge. And so the other role we can play quite concretely in this discussion is really to look at are there things that need to start happening today? Yes, the chair of the panel mentioned that celebration should wait until the ink dries. This must have been very wet ink if it hasn't dried yet. But it's symbolic in that the devil is in the details, and those details need to be worked out. But while those details are being worked out, how do we address some of the data points, some of the information, some of the analysis that needs to be addressed? That's another role that the Global Alliance can play. When we think about investments into decommissioning, there is a significant human component. Communities live around the power plants, communities benefit from the economies that are driven by those power plants. And so it has to be a just transition that addresses these communities, upskills them to new skills, ensures that schools, hospitals, and so on do not suffer when the production shifts elsewhere. And so that's another role we can play in helping think through what are the skills, what are the job skills, what are the investments, social investments required so that it's indeed a just transition and not one that covers climate and forgets people. And as it says in our name, our alliance is for people and planet. So we want to think about both. So those are some of the ideas, but I will conclude by saying that we don't know exactly how we play a role. We're here to hear, to listen, to learn, and collaborate towards this very noble ambition in South Africa. And I'll conclude also by saying that it's incredibly inspiring for the rest of the continent to see South Africa do this. South Africa plays a significant role as one of the largest economies on the continent, and this leadership is critical to demonstrating to other countries on the continent that there is an opportunity to transition in a just way. Thank you.
Joanne, can I steal your... Yes, thank you. Yes, no, absolutely. I will hand over next to Madeleine Ronquest, who has quite a breadth of experiences ranging from risk assessment, as well as how to unfold a decarbonization strategy with respect to portfolios and financing. So I'm going to let Madeleine have a few words now.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Madeleine Ronquest, and I am from FirstRand Group in South Africa. We are a commercial bank, one of the largest by market value in South Africa. And I head up the group's work on environmental, social, and climate risk. I have been involved in this process, yes, for a very long time. This year will be my 20th year at celebration with FirstRand. And so I've seen the progress and the work that has gone into what we see today, which is quite significant for us. We are very proud to be associated with our clients, and I think that is exactly why we decided to have a presence here, to demonstrate that we have long-standing relationships with our large clients who just happen to be in the fossil fuel industry, and that although we won't be financing new, we will honor our clients and we will build our relationships further. It is slightly conditional because our strategy is to build resilience in the communities that we serve and with our clients, and that focuses on mitigation and adaptation. But it is also to help finance the just transition. We fully understand that blended finance models are required, that innovation from financiers are definitely critical for this process. And where there are shortfalls, we have to use our abilities as an intermediary to connect DFI funding, which we can get, to where it needs to go, and work definitely with the DFIs in a hybrid financing kind of way. I mean, Deepak is absolutely correct. A commercial bank functions under very strict governance and regulatory frameworks. And so we are trying to make sure that transactions remain commercially viable, and that we can finance that, and that there's obviously return on investment for our depositors and our investors. And this is the position that we are taking. So we are assisting the just transition financing, and we're not just walking away from fossil fuel. I think that would be irresponsible, especially in a country like South Africa. And then secondly, we have some large partnerships with people that are in companies that are involved in all three of these aspects. So whether it's power, and we significantly finance renewable energy already, whether it's hydrogen, and we're very, very interested in the export possibilities, or whether it is agriculture or anything else that will build resilience for the South African economy. And then, of course, electric vehicles. We have a large component of our business that finances assets. And a big concern for us is obviously stranded assets. And we'd like to be in a position where we can promote electrical vehicles, but there's just so many obstacles at the moment, whether it's import taxes or whether it's availability of lithium batteries, or the cost of the vehicles in effect just does not persuade any person that within the normal financial range to buy an electric vehicle. So this is a lot of the work that we are focusing on. So our strategy is very aligned to the companies that are going to be focusing on these areas. And we are very excited about this agreement. And we would like to further invest and attract investments so that we can make this work. In the end, we're doing this for South Africa. And we have a footprint in sub-Saharan Africa as well, where we think there's a huge amount of potential, where they don't necessarily have the legacy that South Africa has of being a fossil fuel economy for so many years, where they can actually leapfrog to new technologies. And we really want to be involved in those aspects as well. Thanks. Thanks, Steve.
The next panelist to speak for a few minutes is Salim Fakir from the African Climate Foundation. Here you go, Salim.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. I just wanted to pick up a couple of points that I thought came out of the presentations today, and also just to say, as the African Climate Foundation, it's a real pleasure to host this meeting with the PCC. But I think what's significant, even though this is a commitment that needs to go into detail, there is a tectonic shift, and I'll explain what that means. And it's relevant for what the point you made for the rest of the continent of way of structuring, aggregating infrastructure investments in the climate space, which hasn't really been done. As you know, a lot of the climate talk on the continent has been very focused on adaptation and resilience. The South African model is a really great example for how we could do it in oil and gas countries across the continent, and particularly also for countries that are going to supply critical minerals in the future. There's very little talk about the just transition for those countries, like in Congo, in the copper fields in Zambia, including in South Africa on platinum. So we really have to look at this. So the second part of the tectonic shift is that you are not waiting for policy to change, but you're actually driving an infrastructure investment that will catalyze policy change. And I think that's really significant. We're doing some work on that in Namibia at the moment on a very similar kind of approach, where the ACF is funding the Namibian government to look at how to drive green hydrogen in Namibia, but we're not waiting for policy. We're actually creating the investment proposition, and then we looking at what the government needs to change in order to attract the right kind of finance and mobilize other sources of finance. So this is highly relevant for a huge part of the continent, and we hope that at COP27 we can build up some more momentum behind this. Critical, I think, is that the 8.5 billion is clearly not enough, given the fact that the amount of finance required for a massive infrastructure injection on a clean transition is much larger than the 8.5 billion. But what is critical is to really think through the design features of the financing facility, and I think a combination of grant, concession, and also guarantees are going to be crucial to catalyze and mobilize other sources of finance. On the rest of the continent, the cost of capital is still high for transitions, so we have to really figure out how to bring this cost of capital down. And I think the South African example might provide mechanisms for that. And the warning of actually this is foreign denominated currency will require a very crucial balancing act between the trade-off between using foreign denominated support with domestic mobilization. And lastly, I think that what's crucial here, and another point that hasn't really been put down in the discussion here, is that this transition is crucial for South Africa, given its carbon intensity in the face of decarbonization elsewhere in the world, which will penalize South African products and services that are highly carbon intense if there's carbon border tax adjustments. So we really cannot lose on this deal. We have to actually make it work for many other reasons other than just a financing arrangement, but also crucially is interlinkages to the rest of the economy. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Salim. And I think each of the panelists thus far has dropped a few pebbles in the pond, so to speak, which once we have heard from Joanne Bate, we'll try to unpack and find a way of articulating, hopefully, what emerges as some kind of consensual path for what this 8.5 billion means to catalyze, and what the rest of climate finance might look like over the coming decades, actually, to undertake for South Africa, initially as a pilot, but then a very deep tectonic shift and transformation of the base of its political economy, essentially. Joanne, I'm assuming from Johannesburg or Pretoria, I'm not really sure. Welcome to the panel. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, joining from Johannesburg, where we have wonderful technology challenges at the moment and load shedding. So the sooner we transition, the better. So just to pick up on a few points, I think that Salim ended off where I think would be very helpful for me to pick up. And the just element is the critical element for South Africa, considering the manufacturing deficit of the last decade. So we've seen a significant deindustrialization, and with that, job losses. And what we can't afford as a country is to have a greater social and economic impact from the global transition. And that's why from a just perspective, we've been very focused on ensuring that both new energy vehicles and green hydrogen is included in the deal, because those are critical re-industrialization opportunities. From an NEV perspective, there's both an opportunity for industrialization around components. I mean, we are sitting on some of the mineral resources critical to enable the battery value chain and new energy vehicles. So we need to look at how we can unlock that opportunity. We also sit with the big risk of job losses should we not make the transition. And to pick up on the question earlier of are we focusing on export or local demand? And that's really, I mean, at the heart where it comes to manufacturing, we have to be focusing on export because the bulk of our vehicle production is exported production. It's easy for us to import vehicles for those few that can afford the electric vehicles at the top end of the market. What we really need to ensure is that we manage the jobs in the economy and transition our manufacturing sector to new energy vehicles. With that, ensuring that we identify component manufacturing parts beyond just the battery minerals. So I think that's a critical enabler that we need to look at. Included in the plan, we have looked at local infrastructure to ensure that we can decarbonize our electric vehicles in the country, because we believe that the two go hand in hand. But what we need to do is understand the balance of funds that are available to enable that. The cost of transitioning South Africa to alternative energy vehicles is extremely expensive because of the subsidies that will be necessary in order to drive that transition. So we really do need to look at how we can leverage that concessional and grant funding, particularly into the space to pay for the infrastructure as well as the concessions to attract investors into the country and to encourage South Africans to buy the NEVs. From a hydrogen perspective, it's very much a value chain approach that we are taking. We're looking at it as a critical export opportunity in order to decarbonize the world, not just to decarbonize South Africa, but that is one of the that's one of the value propositions. The other critical areas is the aviation fuel, marine, decarbonization of our hard to abate sectors. And that's where we really do need to ensure that the concessional and grant funding are leveraged into those pieces of the value chain. Early investments into green hydrogen is going to come at a greater cost because the cost of the technology has not scaled. So we really do need to ensure that those pilot projects and early opportunities attract some of the concessional and grant funding so that they can be commercially deployed and to give us an opportunity to scale. We also have a significant opportunity in platinum and need to ensure that we unlock that. So just thinking holistically about the financing opportunity, what the focus is ensuring social and economic. And decarbonization is the means through which we achieve the social and economic potential of the country. Blended finance is critical, not only at a project level, but at a country level. We need to ensure that the financing that we're leveraging in now allows us to catalyze other funds, but it is only a start. And we need to ensure that the right levels of concessions go into the right elements in the respective value chains so that we really can set South Africa and the continent up for success in decarbonization and new industries. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Joanne. If we take all of the panelists and what they've been saying, one of the things that stands out for me is that while there is a pledge of sorts for $8.5 billion, the actual cost or investment rather that is needed to ensure that once this journey commences, we see it through to completion or progress it in a manner that results then in irreversibility through natural market dynamics in the end is the message that I'm getting. I'm going to ask Patrick whether development finance is in fact the most effective manner in which to deal with financing that is required in certain stages of development that the commercial sector is probably unable by itself to commence the financing for. And I'm going to also ask him to perhaps challenge Joseph with respect to the question, what is then the role of philanthropic money in this mix?
Thank you very much, Deepak. Absolutely, I think the development finance world has a very critical role in that there is going to be a serious and a critical need for the risk capital, for the feasibility studies. As we are embarking on this, it talks to a lot of technology that will have to be investigated and looked into, and that will require what we call risk capital. And the risk capital does not normally come from the private sector. It tends to come either from the government or from the DFIs, as well as the philanthropic world. So the philanthropic capital, as Joseph said earlier on, is going to be absolutely critical, because that's where you then have this concessionary money that comes in. It tends to be quite patient in terms of the tenure. It tends to have a very a good grace period, low interest rate. In certain cases, it's even a grant. And as the Development Bank of Southern Africa, we are also accredited by the Green Climate Fund and the GEF. So what this does, it then says to us, we can then start accessing that patient capital, those monies that will really come quite handy, because it's concessionary in nature by and large, that we can be able to come in and deploy to make sure that the critical projects are able to take off. And that actually makes it easy to work with the commercial banks, as Madeleine was saying, because commercial banks, they tend to have the skill sets. The private sector tends to have the skill sets that is absolutely critical for the project preparation in terms of the skills to structure these projects in such a way that they are able actually to be viable. Because the private sector will only come in when the projects have become bankable and investable. And once our role, in actual fact, if anything, development finance institutions, we just have to focus on making sure that we come up with the bankable projects. We can then be able to step back, because once that happens, it says we've done our job, because then the private sector comes in. So the catalytic impact of our capital is absolutely critical in this case. And what I also see coming out of here, as Salim was saying earlier on, that the export market is going to be very, very, very difficult for carbon intensive economies, because the footprint of those products going into the external market are going to be met with a carbon tax. How then are our companies going to start coming up with embedded generations to make sure that there are green industrial corridors, so that their products, when they come here, they can be able to demonstrate low carbon footprint? But again, what this also says for South Africa is that as a DFI, together with government and South African society at large, we need to look at how do we also then really push and establish a very strong carbon credit exchange for carbon offsets. I think that will go a long way also in as part of the securitization scheme to making projects possible and viable for South Africa.
Thank you for that, Patrick. I'm going to turn to Madeleine and ask, at which point, Madeleine, in the investment cycle or in the cycle of providing commercial funding to certain projects or certain endeavors, what do you think are the critical factors to begin to get a situation where there's commercial sensibility, given your own portfolios as a bank and the need both to de-risk those from a carbon exposure point of view, but more importantly, you have to, in fact, utilize your capital base to generate returns, which means you have to keep a banking book going. And I'd like to hear your perspectives, as theoretical as they might be at this stage. Where is the tipping point where the commercial sector comes in and, in fact, begins to hopefully result in a virtuous cycle of climate financing going forward?
Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right. I just want to go back a little bit. We talk about society and how it's impacted, but we're also looking at natural capital. So the other sectors, textiles, food security, over and above the power sector. So I think that is more challenging for us to make commercially viable, and that is why we're working very hard at doing that. What I like about what was said previously is that we've been working very hard with the development funders to make projects bankable, and then it speaks for itself. If there's a proven return on investment, that makes absolute sense. The renewable energy project in South Africa made a huge amount of sense for us because it created an enabling framework for us to be able to finance renewable energy at quite a large scale. And so in many cases, we need enabling frameworks. I think we need private capital to venture a little bit more on the risk side. And I do see that happening in the bank. We're trying very hard to make certain transactions work. Where, as you quite rightly said initially, where the technology is new, the models haven't not been tested. But I must say, because this is a focus area, we are making it work. I think the one area where we are struggling a bit is financing the public sector because of many reasons, obviously involved in the public sector. But other than that, commercially, we haven't battled to finance these projects. And then we have a significant niche market for SME development as well, where we focus specifically on green activities. And then obviously through the other products, sustainable bonds and green bonds and capital markets, there are significant opportunities. So far we haven't struggled too much. We've created a specialist committee as well, a credit committee that looks at credit a little bit differently than we have traditionally looked at it. Of course, our associations with the DFIs does provide some kind of a guarantee, and we always look at the risk guarantee and at least taking some of the risk away from the commercial bank. But I think, and I'm not a financier by background, I'm a scientist, but I've learned a lot in the bank, that it is changing. And if there's going to be a solution, it will definitely come from the financiers, because there's a willingness and there's a passion for financing climate.
Thank you. That reminds me, when I was a child, I thought I wanted to be an investment banker because they had the solutions to all of the world's problems. Joseph, if I may turn to you, you described philanthropic capital as agile, as flexible. I'm assuming you didn't mean eccentric, and therefore you would also want to see a clarity of the story and a clarity of the purpose before you as philanthropies would step in, especially to do early stage or accelerator financing. What do you think of the South African story so far?
I think, and thanks for that question. Clarity comes in stages. There's the exploration stage, where are we going? And then there's the details, the budget. And then by the time you're going to First Bank? FirstRand, you must have crossed all the T's, dotted all the whatever you dot, and dotted all the I's, and be able to speak your business plan in whichever direction they ask. Philanthropic capital can be eccentric, especially when the philanthropists themselves are alive. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it allows for asking quirky questions. It allows for a different way of thinking. It allows for people to say, okay, if the end game is decarbonization of an economy, where do we play, and what is the most useful way to spend our money? In terms of how we get there, I think for us, the first question, this is a national issue. This is an agenda that has to be driven from the highest office in each country. Why? Because it's multifaceted. It's not just energy, it's also transport, it's agriculture, it's environment. It's a multi-sectoral challenge. And so for us to engage, one of the key indicators is that at the highest level, whether it's a president or a prime minister, there's buy-in. Everything else you can work through. But if there's no buy-in at that level, then you can do a lot of good work. And I have to say, organizations such as yours have done excellent studies, put out wonderful reports, but to action them, the government has to lead, and that has to be done from the highest office. So I would say, in short, the first thing we ask is there buy-in at the highest level? is that demonstrated by, and in the case of South Africa, we've seen that clearly. We're already in discussions on how that would look like and how we could support that. And then everything else follows. Again, philanthropic money is agile. It can also come in when things are still ambiguous, still hazy, to work through the details alongside partners. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Joseph. I'm going to turn to Salim now and ask him to proverbially join a few dots. Salim, we've come from an environment where the Presidential Climate Commission, announced in December last year, launched really in practical terms February of this year, has already achieved quite a lot. And if I can ask you to describe whether in fact such an approach to consensus building, coalition building, but just as importantly to basing all of that in science and in logic has helped to clarify, at least for us in South Africa, what the various pathways would look like that require different types of funding packages and financing solutions, and why you think this $8.5 billion announced last week could be a potential game changer.
First of all, I just want to say that the experiment of the Presidential Commission is so profound because, as people know from South Africa, our climate work was fairly fragmented. I think the value of the just transition work is not just about climate. It has connected the dot between the climate science and the economic development agenda, and I don't think many people realize how that connection is really what has been brought about. And I think the Presidential Commission has actually provided that connective tissue, but at different levels. The one is that it's allowed the government to connect with each other, which is a funny thing to say, because you know the debate. The environment minister doesn't talk to the development minister, etc. But they've managed to be corralled behind a very good institution. And the second is that people sitting outside don't actually know how the government is thinking about these issues, and this connection has really been built. And I really think, Deepak, that we should expand the PCC model on the rest of the continent, because this issue of climate is moving beyond just a environmental issue. I keep repeating this. It's a whole economy issue. It's a trade issue. It's about industrial development. And we need this kind of stuff mechanism on the rest of the continent. And we really need to try to find ways to promote that. So for me, the 8.5 billion is not just a symbolic effort, but it's about how we can do things differently on the continent. And we don't have to just rely on foreign resources, but we can use them as ways of catalyzing domestic and regional resources. And we really have to think out of the box on this. So if I can leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Salim. Joanne, if I may come to you with your remote presence here. You sketched out various technology or technical developments that need to take place. If I were to challenge you to express that in the form of an industrial development, decarbonization, and economic green growth plan, could you spend a minute telling us what that journey would look like?
So, good question. We very much are mapping out, and it's what the IDC has done. We've worked off the master plans and looked at the interlinkages between the master plans to create industry value chains. And to me, the value it's an end-to-end value chain, understanding how everything fits into the broader perspective. Where is the renewable energy opportunity as a use case in decarbonization, and what are the components and value streams necessary to deliver on that renewable energy? And then what are the outputs of renewable energy, which would be decarbonization, the hydrogen economy, and then there's the component pieces there. So I'm not thinking of a very simple map, but it is, I mean, if I think about the enablers, I'll talk to the enablers, I think that'll be far simpler. So it's an enabling policy environment. We need to ensure, and green hydrogen has been really interesting with this because we've been asked the question a number of times, who owns it? And green hydrogen is energy. It is, it sits within DTIC, it sits within science and innovation. There's no single owner of green hydrogen. So we need to ensure that we have an enabling policy environment where a platform like the PCC allows us not to reach consensus, but in Vali Musa's words, provides us with the data to demonstrate the right outcomes that we need to pursue. So enabling policy environment, working collectively, we need to think not about our individual companies, individual departments, but really take a country view. And I think more importantly, a regional view. We really need to think about the regional opportunity that flows from this. And we need to attract foreign technology, but also look at what it is that we can exploit locally to create sustainable value opportunities. You know, we keep looking at decarbonization as something that we need to do. I did say that earlier. But I really do think we are sitting on critical minerals to enable the decarbonization of the or the decarbonization components for the world, and we need to think about how we don't just give those resources away the way we did in previous generations, but actually look at it how we exploit that, leverage local technology, and attract local partners. So partnering for growth, this is SDG 17 is, I think, the mantra for what it is that we're trying to achieve. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm going to turn to Patrick now and ask him to try, if possible, pull things together in a way that makes sense for us.
Thank you, Tipak. I think it's going to be important for us to first and foremost acknowledge that there has to be a transition to this net zero future we're talking about come 2050. But that then starts to say there's got to be brand new instruments, financing instruments that come to the picture. One of those instruments will be the catalytic instruments that now have got to be worked on much more than before. Like, how then do we ensure that there are much more stronger guarantee instruments and insurance instruments, which then talks to our, what Priscilla wants to call as transition finance. Transition finance is the finance that is made available for projects, even if it means new fossil fuel, but as long as there is a very clear, unambiguous, just transition into renewable energy. So that transition finance is going to have to play a much more bigger role. And that transition finance has got to be available in much more abundance than before to enable us to move in that direction. But we also need to understand that there is, as much as we're talking about people, there is also nature, which talks to our investment into biodiversity, because there can't be people if there is no sustainable nature. So the sustainability of both people and nature has got to be at the core of what we do. As we are moving on this, we have to start looking at how do we enable it as DFIs, multilateral development banks, philanthropic players in the form of like the Rockefeller Foundation. We will have to play this role very, very meaningfully. But SMEs have a much more fundamental role because they tend to create much more sustainable jobs in the process, which will help our country to become inclusive as we're moving forward.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm sure there are questions on the chat, which the administrators will send to me now. Or Joanne, do you want to? While Joanne is moving up, are there any questions in the audience itself, in person? Yes, Nick.
Thank you. My name is Nick Robbins, Professor of Sustainable Finance at London School of Economics. Firstly, to salute the South African team for putting together the 8.5 package. I think it's really inspirational. The question I'd like to ask the panel, on building on the discussions we heard from Rudy and Mandy earlier, is here at COP, we have the GFAN's commitment on 130 trillion of private sector capital and assets, huge numbers. Very interestingly, just transition is throughout that package. So in terms of actually how this initial catalytic deal harnesses domestic banks, domestic institutional investors, but also global asset owners who now want to get to net zero, but do it in a just transition way. I just wondered if any of the panelists had thoughts about how to make that connection. Thank you very much.
Joseph will field that question.
Thank you. I believe it's a function of understanding everybody's role in the investment stack or the capital stack. I think it's a continuum from grants all the way to very expensive capital. And if you look at the bulk of the funds available for investing in climate, they're really private sector commercial capital. And what I think people like ourselves at the Alliance, development banks can do is spend our money in a way that unlocks this enormous resources. How do we do that? I think there are a couple of ways. One is an investor wants to see what is the end game, what are the risks, what is the opportunity, what are the risks, and what are the mitigants, and then they can make an investment decision. So being able to prepare those investment proposals is incredibly critical. But if I am an investor and I'm looking for investing in infrastructure in South Africa, infrastructure is long-term, it's relatively low return, and therefore should be lower risk. And so having a national plan, the government having the right plan, the right policies and regulations that convince me as a private investor that my capital is safe, my return is predictable, and it's predictable for a long time through different political cycles is incredibly critical. So in my view, the way to unlock the trillions of dollars that will actually can only come from private sector. They won't come from philanthropies, they won't come from development banks, they have to come from commercial sources. The way to do that is have a clear plan as a country, have the policies and regulations that give investors the confidence that they can model their returns and feel confident that those returns are realistic. Thank you.
Patrick wants to contribute, and then I'll give you a list of questions and we'll field those questions all together.
I think briefly, that $130 trillion commitment by the private sector was, to me, almost like a broadcast saying we are here and we are ready. So what then it says, the implication there too, or thereof, is that as the development finance world, together with our philanthropic players, but the entire financial actors have a very fundamental role in making sure that we then are able to create an enabling environment for that 180 trillion US dollars. We have to make sure that we come up with projects that are quite attractive for them to come in. As you all know, that capital is like birds. They will then fly to where it's warm. So all this says is that create a warm environment for me, I'm gonna fly to you. So now as South Africa, we have a duty and a responsibility to do whatever we can to make sure that we first are able to know exactly where that capital is, what appetite it has, and where does it want to come to, and create those projects so that it is able actually to be catalyzed into those projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Joanne?
Thank you. Just to reflect, I suppose I'm going to summarize the kinds of issues that are coming up on the chat. And I think the one question that has been asked a number of times through both sessions is really about how we create the skills base and the human capital base to deliver on this huge undertaking, not only, I suppose, from a finance perspective, but what is the role of the kinds of organizations in this room in relation to the development of the human capital that is necessary. Secondly, there's a set of questions around, I suppose, how the collaboration that everybody has been talking about, how does it happen and who drives it? And what is the role of government in particular in driving it? Where does this all get coordinated, if it does get coordinated at all? And I think then there's a question really about transparency and accountability. A lot of these deals start off being announced with a great fanfare, but then go into private rooms. This has fundamental implications for the country as a whole. How does the country as a whole make sure that the resources are being spent widely and the desired outcomes are being achieved? So I think some very big, deep questions that are not necessarily, they don't have easy answers, but maybe if the panel, Deepak, in closing, could reflect on some of those. Thanks.
So I'm going to suggest how we handle that. Thanks, Joanne, for summarizing the essential categories of issues that, in particular, people who have joined online are concerned about or are asking. I'm going to go panelist by panelist and give them maybe 2 minutes each to cover some of those issues that have been raised, but also give us their parting shot as to how we move this project, absolutely critical catalytic project, forward. And I'll go this time in order of the panel.
Thank you. On the jobs piece, I think it has to be a systematic and intentional approach by government and partners in developing curriculum, training courses, and driving the knowledge base that's required for the sector, and not just the power generation side, but also emerging green industries. The governments have to identify whether it's the training ministry or the economic development ministry, and really mandated to think of the emerging skills required. I would also say on where this needs to be housed. Every country must decide for itself, but I think some key requirements on where the housing or what the housing needs to have are: one, absolute critical access to the president and the prime minister or the top leadership of a country. As I mentioned earlier, this is multifaceted. It must incorporate all the agencies in the country, and therefore having a coordinated role that reports to the president is critical. That being said, presidents come and go. So this agency needs to be independent. It needs to be independently funded so that it's not at the mercy and the whims of each regime. And it also cannot be held hostage in a budgetary way. So independent budgetary and operational independence is critical. And the third piece, of course, is who is in that agency. Again, it's a multifaceted challenge. So it cannot be politicians, it cannot be just scientists, it must also be social scientists and a very well thought through representation that can then engage on an international basis. This is a global conversation, so it's not just internal engagement, it needs to be very well positioned to engage on an international level so that the country is positioned to make the best of what's available in terms of climate finance while addressing the challenges that may come with carbon taxes and so on. Thank you.
I want to connect to my colleague next to me. And the one thing that came up just now is informed decision-making, specifically from investors. And I'm excited because today we have a lot more information and tools available, readily available to us. So as a business in South Africa, we've connected through the NBI, and they have done some fantastic work where we don't all have economics teams in-house, but they have, for the first time that I have seen, plotted just transition pathways for different sectors. And I would invite you to look at those publications. they are truly insightful, especially to investors communities and definitely for banks. I mean, we have found such a lot of value in decision making around that. And the one thing that I'm also truly excited about, and that leans more towards collaboration, is this is the first time that I've seen such a scale of collaboration between the Presidential Climate Commission and business. And that is truly, it's engaging and it's phenomenally important. It's significant at this time. And I think we are moving rapidly forwardly. And this is something that I haven't seen in my career as yet. So I'm really excited about the future. The other thing I want to agree on is that this is a multi-skilled operation. We've learned very quickly that in terms of understanding our own climate risk and those of our clients, it does not just depend on scientists, and we've had to leverage off expertise within inside the group and very talented, intelligent people, understanding structured finance, understanding capital markets, understanding risk, but there is a shortage of skills. So currently, we are looking for an ESG specialist and climate financier. And we are really battling in South Africa to find it. And I understand when I was in London, I was very envious because apparently there are many skills available there. So I do think that the UK universities specifically is absolutely more focused on climate change, on climate economics, on macroeconomics and so on. And I really would like for our own academic institutions to also develop those skills, present those courses and train young people to get and manage those skills so that they can get into the financial sector and also into the other sectors, of course, because that is where the solution lies. And it's combining the old intelligence like myself, well, not intelligence, but the old experience with the new information and new technologies and understanding. And that is really what I'm looking forward to.
Joanne, can we take a few rounding words from you, please?
Thanks. On the training and skills development, I think it really needs to be done with intent. We need to understand not only what are the skills that are required, but where are we moving from. So be very clear on what we are building, at what level we need to build it from foundation phase all the way through to tertiary education and trade skills. We often think in the context of what curricula can we put into schools and universities, but we need to think about the trade skills we actually need to develop as well. So I think a very holistic plan linked to the various sectors and master plans and subsectors in order to ensure we develop the right skills for the future. Where does it get coordinated? I think that it needs to be broken down. It's multifaceted. There are projects which will be managed at a DFI, private sector, public sector entity level, and then there's the just element that needs that very focused coordination. I think the comment was made by Joseph, closest to the presidency. I think the Presidential Climate Commission is a wonderful implementation or enablement partner to actually drive both that collaboration and that outcome. And to ensure transparency, the programs associated with the just transition need to be clearly defined and the outcomes that we're wanting to achieve. And there needs to be proper measurement put in place to ensure that what we are wanting to achieve is measured and sustained on a continuous basis. So I think I'll just pause there. I'm conscious of time.
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much, Deepak. I think from my perspective, at the end of the day, we have to do this for South Africa. At the end of the day, honest and ethical leadership is going to be what will take us to the net zero emission stage come 2050. But we need to start at a practical level, start to repurpose some of our TVET colleges to talk to the skill sets that is required here, because then you'll be fitting into the economy. But again, working together with the civil society, labor, business, financial actors, because financial actors really can make this thing work or not work. So getting all the financial actors around the table, including the central banks, will be absolutely critical for the success of this journey that we're embarking on. But what I can say is that it is possible. We really have to commit ourselves into it and make sure that we are held accountable. Thank you.
I'll just say one thing, Deepak, I know we're running out of time. When we ran the renewables IPP program in South Africa, we didn't have all the skills aligned, but the program itself was able to create momentum and catalytic effect on skills development. So obviously, we do need to import some of the skills. We also have now virtual capability, right? But I think just the aggregation of the investment actually drives the momentum behind skills development. I think that was a tremendous learning. And the second point is that if you don't have long-term consistency of policy, like we've seen with the renewables program, the skills, we destroy the skills we build. So we really have to, if we want to really build long-term skills base, particularly with universities, business, small enterprise, we have to stick to a policy course, because linking investment with industrial development is not today's just an overnight journey. It's a 20, 30-year program, and that's what allows you to then spin off other types of investments as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Salim, and thank you to my very, very esteemed panel, including Joanne from afar. I want to close this session, if it's possible, by running a video which has been produced by the Deputy Chair of the Presidential Climate Commission. As we get ready to do that, let me say that it has been a great pleasure hosting this conversation. It's clear that it is multifaceted. It is clear that it is complex. But what is absolutely clear is that it is a journey that we need to undertake. It is a journey that doesn't have optionality. If we do not undertake this journey and find the solutions, financial, human, technical, consensual, and justice built into this transition, we falter. And the beauty of the 8.5 billion promise made last week is not that South Africa is such a special case and we simply celebrate it and go home happy about it. It is in fact the cutting edge. It is in fact the first step in a journey that the world has to undertake. And as South Africa, and certainly from the South African Presidential Climate Commission, we feel hugely privileged, but understand the pressure that comes with this offer that's on the table for us to in fact commence this journey and in some ways not only lead by example, but provide the lessons as we undertake this journey for the rest of the world. With that, I want to thank everyone who has made time to attend the session, both in person as well as remotely. Thank you very much.
Our atmosphere has been ravished in the name of money. The rich and powerful have consumed our common atmosphere without paying for it. Taking what does not belong to you, in plain language, is called theft. The burning of oil and coal without paying for the resulting emissions has been one of the biggest drivers of economies in modern times. Therefore, much of the wealth of rich countries has been the result of the proceeds of crime. The crime of expropriating common property for private gain. The crime of destroying nature. We expect the climate culprits to stand up and be counted at COP26. We expect them to show remorse. We expect them to tell the world exactly what they intend to do to right the wrongs which they have committed.